everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. This webinar is part of our methodology breakdown series where we talk about a methodology we've digitized and contributed to the open source library. Today's policy is built based on the requirements outlined in Gold Standards methodology for methane emission reduction by adjusted water management practice in rice cultivation. In our agenda today, we have 8 topics we will cover. These include a little information about Envision blockchain, a Guardian overview, a recap of our previous webinars. We'll go over our policy development checklist, do a quick methodology introduction. Then we'll talk about methane emissions in rice cultivation, how VERs are calculated, which will be the token we're minting today. Then we'll go over our schemas, workflow, and demo, and we'll also be talking about our live data migration towards the end. Envision Blockchain Solutions builds applications for the Web3 space, and we focus on guiding organizations through 3 major milestones on their Web3 journey: use case analysis, proof of concept development, scaled deployments, and we're also the builders and maintainers of the Guardian. So as you may know, the process of designing and collecting the supporting data for carbon claims is heavily manual and prone to errors. This can be due to a variety of factors, including poor data quality, a lack of assurance, potential double counting, greenwashing, and just an overall lack of trust. The Guardian is here to address these issues by leveraging a cutting-edge policy workflow engine. The Guardian can mirror the standards and business requirements of regulatory bodies, creating extremely flexible digital methodologies known as DMRV. This approach not only helps organizations ensure compliance with the regulatory requirements, but it also enables them to streamline their carbon accounting processes, improve their data quality, and reduce the risk of errors and inaccuracies. So to the right, you could see our policy workflow engine, and you could think of each one of these blocks as Legos where you put them together to build your policy. We'll also be looking at what our policy looks like, the one we're going to be demoing today, and how these blocks all come together to mimic the workflow that we have. So in the center of this system are 4 main technologies that help us provide trustworthy and clear solutions for the environmental market. So first, we use decentralized identifiers, also known as DIDs. These are unique identifiers that let individuals and groups create their own IDs using systems that they trust. DIDs ensure that environmental credits go to the right parties and can't be duplicated or tampered with. We also use verifiable credentials, known as VCs. These are digital documents that give information about the subject, who issued it, the type of credential, specific details about the subject, and proof of how the credential was obtained. So you might see things like all the calculations and data that is needed to make sure that we're minting the correct amount. VCs also make sure that the environmental credits are given only to those who meet the necessary requirements and that the credits are valid and trustworthy. And lastly, we use verifiable presentations, VPs, which are just a group of 1 or more VCs. Now let's go into a recap of our past webinars. Each webinar focuses on a specific methodology from our open source library, and it's aimed at helping our users and anyone interested in the Guardian to understand how these methodologies can be streamlined for efficient implementation. We've covered methodologies from Vera, Gold Standard, and CDM, and you can find videos for each one of these at the Envision Blockchain YouTube channel. So here you see a list of some of our previous ones, and we have some additional ones to this list here. Now, to create these policies, we follow this checklist that we've worked together with our team to develop. So in this slide, we'll discuss the essential steps you can take to create a policy for the Guardian, and creating a well-defined policy is crucial for effectively implementing the Guardian tool into your projects. So let's go through these steps together. Here we have step 1, which is to identify the standard and an appropriate methodology. So you always want to begin by identifying the relevant standard and methodology that aligns with your project's goals and requirements. And this will serve as the foundation for developing your policy. Step 2 is to review the standard and methodology documents. So you'll want to make sure you read through the documentation provided by the standard and methodology, ensuring that there's a comprehensive understanding of their guidelines, criteria, and principles. So aside from just the methodology document itself, there's usually other documents that outline that standards, processes, and requirements. So today we'll be looking at what the stakeholder consultation would look like. Maybe you have an annual report that you have to submit. All of those might be separate PDFs that you want to look into. Step 3 is to identify roles, processes, and requirements. And by identifying the various roles involved, you'll be able to define the responsibilities in the Guardian. Then determine the necessary processes and requirements outlined by the standard. So again, this is something that's going to be outlined in those PDFs that I previously spoke about. Step 4 is to identify input parameters and equations. You want to understand the specific input parameters and equations used in the methodology. These will be essential for accurately calculating and reporting the correct values. If you're using a policy in our open source library, then these equations will just need to be filled out using our forms in order for them to be auto-calculated. However, if you're creating one from scratch, you want to make sure that you're using something to map out those equations. So maybe it's in Excel, and we do have a template available that I can show you where you can download that and use it as a guide for everything that's going to be needed in order to create the policy for the Guardian. Step 5 is to create a workflow and schema. This is when you would develop a clear workflow and schema that outlines the step-by-step processes for using the Guardian within your project. So this will help streamline operations and ensure consistent application as this policy is being used. And then the final step is to use our policy configurator and put all those blocks together to create a policy for the Guardian. So now we're going to go into a methodology introduction. And again, the methodology we're looking at today is about methane emission reductions by adjusted water management practices in rice cultivation. And this is version 1 coming from Gold Standard. So this methodology focuses on reducing anaerobic decomposition of organic matter in rice cropping soils. Measures include changing water regimes from continuous to periodic flooding, adopting alternate wetting and drying methods, aerobic rice cultivation, and switching to direct seeded rice. It has been adapted from the small-scale CDM methodology called AMS-III.AU. You'll see that there are a lot of projects using AMS-III.AU, as the Gold Standard one is pretty new in the space. Conditions for global applicability include predominant irrigation with extended flooding, controlled irrigation and drainage facilities, no decrease in the rice yield, compliance with local regulations, and access to infrastructure for methane emission measurement. This methodology can be applied to any scale of project activity, whether it's micro scale, small scale, or large scale. Now, for small or micro scale projects, you can use a simplified approach when calculating their emission reductions, which we'll look at later in this presentation. So I wanted to point out the stakeholder consultation, as this is a new form that you're going to be filling out that hasn't been included in our previous policies. So this stakeholder consultation makes sure that there's meaningful engagement to discuss potential environmental, social, and economic impacts throughout the project's life cycle. It also looks into gender sensitivity, so any gender issues integrated into the project design, planning, and implementation. And it makes sure that there's equal and effective participation of women and men ensured in stakeholder consultations. The consultation process is a minimum of 2 rounds, including a mandatory physical meeting and feedback round lasting at least 1 month. It should be conducted before the project start date. However, if it was conducted after, you just need to clarify why. An explanation of how the stakeholder comments were considered in the project design and implementation is taken into account. And invitations to all relevant stakeholders, including the local communities, policymakers, NGOs, and Gold Standard representatives, is also added into that form. And evidence of that invitation sent and any comments that were received back will also be taken account into the form. Now, a little bit about methane emissions in rice cultivation and why it matters. So approximately 8% of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions globally come from rice cultivation. Methane, which is a byproduct of flooded rice paddy fields, is 28 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And that's why looking into projects that aren't just looking into the carbon dioxide reductions and one that maybe is considering the methane is really important in this space. Flooded rice paddy fields contribute to 12% of the global anthropogenic methane emissions, which is equivalent to 1.5% of the total warming effect of all greenhouse gases. Traditional rice farming practices include keeping fields flooded to suppress weed emergence, leading to methane production as organic matter decays without oxygen present. Alternate wetting and drying, also known as AWD, Water management involves periodically drying rice fields instead of continuously flooding them. So here we have a pie chart showing the global methane emissions. And as you can see, most of them, about 68%, are coming from enteric fermentation. Then we have a few coming from manure management, whether it's cattle, swine, or other. And then we have 17% coming from rice cultivation. So again, this is why it's really important to have these methodologies or projects that are looking into how we could reduce emissions in the rice field. Then we also have a reduction in methane emissions by 30 to 50% when we're looking at the alternate wetting and drying. And we're also decreasing water use by 10 to 20% without affecting the rice yields. And as mentioned before, methane from flooded rice fields is 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So again, it's really important to look at methane when we're considering how we could reduce emissions. So now, how are VERs calculated? And these are the credits that we're minting by using this methodology. So here we have some schemas that you're going to be filling out as you go through the project forms or the monitoring report. We have the first one, which is the key project information, and this is regarding the project activities and the project developers. So we might be collecting information of who they are, where they're located, what project they have, if they already have maybe the project ID that we could reference. Then we have the project design document, which is also used by project developers to submit documentation for certification purposes. And we have the stakeholder consultation report, which I mentioned before. We're making sure that, again, there's meaningful engagement with all stakeholders and that comments are taken into account. And if they're not, we have an explanation as to why. We also have the standard or simplified emission reduction schema. This standard and simplified emission reductions form will collect all the data that is required to calculate the project's reductions. Another schema you'll be looking at is the monitoring report. This will cover information from all the previous schemas, allowing the project developer to make updates as needed. So currently in this policy, you're going to see all of these forms located in one project form that you're going to be filling out. They'll be separated by headers. However, it may be separated in the future, and this is good to hear some feedback if maybe it's easier to have it all located in one form, or if it's better to have it in the more traditional sense of having them separated into separate forms that you fill out as you go through this process. So if you have any feedback, it'd be good to hear. And then finally, we have our annual report. This annual report will be submitted with the monitoring report. It collects information about any changes that have occurred, and it'll also ask why those changes occurred. So we get some evidence there as well. Now, when we talk about how we calculate this, these equations come out directly from the methodology itself. And as I mentioned before, we have a standard approach and a simplified approach as defined by the methodology. So if you're using if you have a large scale project, you want to make sure you're using the standard approach. We'll be taking into account the baseline emissions, project emissions, as well as an uncertainty deduction that has a default of 15%. Here it looks like we only have a total of 4 parameters. However, the standard approach does collect more data than the simplified approach. As a simplified approach, we'll be using a lot of default factors. And then here we have our simplified approach. And as you can see, there are more parameters taken account in here. But again, there will be a lot of defaults being used. So as you're filling out the form, it'll be quicker to fill out the simplified one rather than the standard one. However, you could only use the simplified approach if you're looking at a micro scale project or a small scale project. So let's go into the policy schema and workflow. As I mentioned before, we designed the schemas first in Excel, and then we transferred over into the Guardian. Using our template, you can just import this Excel, and it should auto-populate all the schema requirements with everything that you've outlined within the Excel. This first tab that I have here, we have the key project information. And as you could see, we have all the fields that will be required in there. We list them as required, yes or no here. Then we have the field type, whether we want it to be a string, a date, an enum, help text. Those are the main ones that I'm using in this tab here. We also have a parameter, which is referencing any enums. And you'll see that we have different tabs for that at the very end. So when we reference an enum, we separate it in a sheet like this. So this is the question that we're asking, and these will be the options the user has. And we want to make sure we're linking this into, let's go back, into this field here. So when we import this to the Guardian, it knows that we have these drop-downs available for the user. And then what I was mentioning before was this field that it's all gray. This is what we would have called a click to add, or if we're adding an entity. So here we have new areas associated with the project. If I have more than one, I want to make sure I separate it in this way. So when we import it into the Guardian, it knows that the user can continue to add these 3 fields for every new area that they have. So we're collecting information about the summary, maybe a description, the size, and the date that it was added to the project. Then moving into our PDD, we again have this same template where we're going to outline the required field, the field type, parameter, visibility, question, if we want to allow multiple answers, and these are sample answers we have here. And we're collecting all the information that's required in the PDD. And if we keep going down, we also have a questionnaire to determine if we're using the standard emission reductions approach or if we're using the simplified approach. So we'll ask something like, is the project micro scale, small scale, or large scale? The user can outline that. We also have some help text up here that will reflect in the policy when they're filling out this form. And then we have our calculations. And there are many sheets there outlining the baseline, the groups that are associated in that project, what their water regime are, on season, pre-season, if they have any organic amendments. We also have a sheet for the soil pH, so organic carbon, climate input numbers, and all of these are used to calculate the baseline and the project values. And then as we go down, you're seeing the sheets for the simplified emission reduction approach. And all these blue sheets are going to be to calculate the emission reductions using that simplified approach. So once all of this has been outlined, then it would be easy to just go ahead and import this into the Guardian, which I'll show you once we go into our demo in a few minutes. All right, so now we're going to take a look at our policy workflow, and we're going to be following these steps today when we do our demo of the policy. So as you can see, we have different users here. We have the project proponent. This is a gold standard approved VBB, gold standard, the Technical Advisory Committee, and NGO supporters. So starting all the way at the top here, we would see that the project proponent will complete and submit the key project information and their draft PDD. Again, we have merged all of these forms into one. So you'll be submitting your key project information, your PDD, your stakeholder consultation, as well as your estimates for the emission reductions. Then Gold Standard will go ahead and they have access to all of that information. They can do a quick review and they can go ahead and list that project into the registry. Then the project proponent will go ahead and appoint their VBB once the VBB creates an account, and it notifies Gold Standard so they can approve this VBB as well. The project proponent will go ahead and complete all of the information that they have, which is then submitted to the VBB for validation. And the VBB can go ahead and look at the VC doc that is submitted with all the project info and go ahead and approve or reject it. They can also submit a comment. Once the VBB has approved it, the Technical Advisory Committee and the NGO supporters have access to this document, as well as Gold Standard, where they can leave comments. Once that's been approved, then we're at the point where this Gold Standard project is a Gold Standard certified design. And now the project proponent could go ahead and complete and submit their monitoring report. So here in the monitoring report, you'll see that we've also put together the annual report. It'll be towards the end. We also have all the calculations that could be resubmitted there with their remeasurements. Then the VBB can go ahead and review it, again, submit any comments that they have, and the Technical Advisory Committee and NGO supporters will have access to that document for comments as well. Gold Standard can review and approve. And then we're going down the path to having the minting of those VERs. Once that happens, then we can go ahead and look at our trust chain. Now here, this is where things get a little different from our previous demos, where we have a renewal. We're looking at a timeline of maybe 5 years that this project has been ongoing, and then it is ready to have a certification renewal, which will go ahead and submit all this information again, whether it's the key project information that needs to be updated, the PDD or the monitoring report. The VBB can go ahead and approve that, and Gold Standard will also review and approve or reject, and we'll go down again to minting VERs. So now we could move into the Guardian to see this workflow live. All right, so I'm going to give you a quick tour of the Guardian before we get started. So if I click up here, we're going to go to the home page that it would usually take you to. Here you'll see your DID document, your VC document, what your balance and H bar is, your Hedera account ID, your DID, user topic, and initialization topic. We could also go ahead and click this drop down for the policies, where we'll see the schemas, the artifacts, modules, policies, and tools tabs all show up. We could go ahead and click into the schemas so I can show you how we import these Excels or how you can download the template. So here you'll also see some tabs for the policy schemas, module schemas, tag schemas, system schemas, and tool schemas. You could click this drop down to refine the schemas that reflect here based on the methodology or policy that you want to see. Then we have these buttons here to create a schema to generate the Excel template. So if you click this, it'll download that template to your files. You can click here to import, and we have a compare feature for schemas. So if I go ahead and click create schemas, you'll see that you can give your schema a name. You can choose what policy it belongs to. Here you can choose if you want this to be a verifiable credential or an encrypted verifiable credential. Now we can use the encrypted verifiable credential if we have something that needs to be set to private. So let's say I have an address that I would not like to make public, then I can go ahead and click private. And that's going to go ahead and encrypt that information so that it's not public. You could also give your schema a description. Here you can add fields, clicking that button. As you saw in the Excel template, we collect information for the field type, whether it's a number, integer, string, Boolean, etc. We can also choose if we want this field to be required or not. So if it's not required, we can either choose none or hidden. Hidden can be used when we have an auto calculation. So let's say it's the fields for emission reductions. We know that uses a formula. Then we can go ahead and hide that from the user, as they're not going to be conducting any math there. It's all going to be auto calculated. And then if we want to make sure that the user fills out a certain field, then we can go ahead and click required, and the form can't be submitted until that field is filled with data. Now, if you're importing, you could either import a schema through a file, through IPFS, or you could import from Excel using the template that you would download using that second button there. Here we could move into the policies tab, which is where we're mainly going to be today. And that I've imported 2 gold standard policies. We're going to be using this top one here. So we have this in dry run. However, you could either click stop if you want to go ahead and edit, or you could publish this policy to make it public. Now to look at the policy configurator, we have this pencil icon here. You can click on that, and that's where we're going to see those Legos that we were talking about. So I could go ahead and expand this by clicking this button up here. And now we're going to see all of the workflow steps that I've outlined in a more technical view. So you're seeing the gold standard steps up here in this container. Everything inside is all the steps that they're going to be taking, all the information that's sent out or received. You'll also see when they add a project, the monitoring report tabs and everything that could be done in there. We have all the information associated with that token and all the blocks for the trust chain. So these are going to be all of our documents that are going to show up in the trust chain. Then we have our container for the project proponent. So all the workflow steps are outlined in here as to what the project proponent has to do and complete. You'll also see some CDM tools in here. These tools are used to determine additionality, so the user has an option of using tool 1, 19, or 21. And then all that data is going to go ahead and go into this custom logic block where all the calculations happen. We have the same thing for the report. And then you'll see the VVB's workflow that's going to be all inside this container. And again, those are all the steps that they follow. We have one for each user. So if we keep going down, we'll see the rest of the users as well. So here we have enabled comments for the technical advisory committee and for the NGO supporters. You could also click these tabs here to see if there are any modules associated with this policy or tools. And as we mentioned before, we have CDM tool 1, 19, and 21. You could also change the theme. So right now we're in a default. You can change it to roles. So it'll change the colors based off the role that we're talking about. And here we have 5 roles: the project proponent, the VVB, the technical advisory committee, NGO supporters, and gold standard. And you'll see that reflect here on those blocks. And then the last theme is going to be by API access. So whether it's post and get, only get, or not accessible. All right, so we've made it to this policy. So the first thing that I usually do is I go ahead and create a user. We're going to select it once to create one user. And then we're going to go to virtual user 2. Where we're going to click what role we want. So for this one, we want the project proponent, as they're the first ones to submit project information. We're going to select next. And then you see that this new project button appears. We also have tabs for the projects, monitoring reports, and tokens. We're going to select new project, and now we have all of the fields that we need to fill out. So I'm going to go ahead and fill that out with some sample information coming from my Excel. I'd like to note that at the very top here, we do have this test button. So if you're testing out a policy and you want to go through it quickly, you could go ahead and click test, and you'll have some sample information auto-populated into these fields. And then here we have an image for the signatures. So the person would have to sign something and go ahead and upload that image. And you'll see that in a few spots here in this form. Gold Standard also likes to collect pictures from the physical meetings as a best practice. So we would go ahead and upload that too. And you can go ahead and click add fields if you have more than one photo. All right, so now that we've finished all of the project information, the stakeholder consultation, we're moving into the calculations. So here the user can select if they want to use a simplified or the standard approach. And keep in mind that this data here is just sample data. It's not associated with any project that's currently certified. All right, so now that everything's been filled out, you'll see that this create button turns dark blue, and we could go ahead and select create. So now we see that the status is stating that it's waiting to be listed. So we have to go back to the administrator. We're going to select project pipeline. And now you see that they have a list button. They can also go ahead and open up the document, see everything that was submitted. You'll see all those images reflecting here of the signatures. And they can go ahead and select list. So now we're going to create another user. We can create 3. One's going to be the VBB, our Technical Advisory Committee, and our NGO supporters. We have to assign them their roles. So we're in virtual user 3 right now. We're going to assign them the VBB role and select next. We're going to give them a name. I'm just going to put in VBB. And I'm going to select create. We see it says waiting for approval. This is the administrator who has to approve this VBB before they could be assigned to the project. So we have a tab for approve VBB. We're going to select that. And we can click approve. So now let's go to virtual user 4. And we want to assign roles to our last 2 users, which is the Technical Advisory Committee. They're going to have an account here, and then we can do the NGO supporters. All right, so we're going to the project proponent where they can assign the VBB to this project. So here we have this assign section and a drop down. You should see the VBB there. All right, I'm going back to the VBB to see their projects tab where this project should be reflecting. Okay, so they can also view this document, the same one that the registry had access to. It should have everything that was filled out, whether it's from the PDD, the key project details, or all the calculations, and then they can go ahead and validate it and leave a comment. Okay, so we're in the role for the Technical Advisory Committee, and following this workflow, they would go ahead and leave a comment as well, since they have access to this document by clicking the View Document button. And then let's go look at this last role here of the NGO supporters. They can also leave a comment. Okay, so now the project proponent could go ahead and submit their report. Now, this usually wouldn't occur right after. There'd be some time in between where they're collecting information, they're collecting data on the field. You might have a VVB that conducts an assessment in person. And then you would go ahead and fill this out and update it as needed. And then here you would state what parameter you're talking about in the unit, a description of that parameter. If you're familiar with how these PDDs look, you'll see this towards the end of those PDFs. And they're usually set in somewhat of a table format, so you could go ahead and continue adding them as you have multiple parameters that need to be monitored. And a lot of these questions would have a paragraph form if it relates to the project. A lot of them are on a legal basis of if the land is being used legally, if it was taken from indigenous people, if there are any gender issues, or maybe there is inequality throughout this project, that would all be stated in here. All right, so now we're back to the stakeholder consultation. And the stakeholder consultation doesn't only occur in the beginning of the project. You want to make sure that you're also doing it throughout the project, that there's consistent communication with all the stakeholders involved. So this is the first time we're looking at the annual report. We'll have some extra questions in here too. So we'll collect a bit of information about the project, some info that could also be found in the key project information. All right, I'm going to go ahead and select Create. This is for the monitoring report. So now we're going to go ahead and go back to the VVB. Select Monitoring Reports. And then we're going to click Verify. They also have access to that document like they previously did for the PDD and the key project information. They can now view the monitoring report and select Verify. And now we see that it says that project was verified. So we're going to go to the administrator. Select Monitoring Reports. And now they can approve and reject this. And they also have access to that document. We're going to select Approve. And then they can select Mint. Now keep in mind, again, the data that we used is not associated to any projects, so we won't be minting anything that's currently registered to the Gold Standard Registry. Okay, then we can go ahead and click on Token History, that it's all been minted and transferred. Okay, and any token amounts that you would mint are going to show up here. So if we minted 1,000 tokens today, you would have seen 0 out of 1,000 till that's completed its minting. Then it would reflect your total number. And here you see our trust chain. This is currently our VP. Our trust chain will be down here. You have information about the token, who received this, that has been minted, the token amount, what has been transferred, the mint date. You also see this verified signature, what policy is being used and the description of that policy, as well as what version is it in. Is it published or is this in dry run? We were currently in dry run, and the issuer's name. Then you're going to see all of these VC files up here. So we have everything from when the policy was created. You can see the VC file for that. When the project was created, you could also see that VC file of all that information. The completion of the project fields, project being approved, the monitoring report that was created, the automatic completion of all of the fields, the monitoring report being verified, and down here it mentions all the parties that were associated with those actions. So here we know virtual user 3 was our VPP, and they went ahead and verified this monitoring report. Then we had our administrator that approved it. So you're seeing all of these actions reflected down here in our trust chain, and then all the way to the minting of these VCUs. So before we end, I wanted to go over our live data migration, which plays an important role here, as if we go back to the workflow, we are at this point. Once this project has reached its 5 years of being active, we would want to go ahead and do a renewal where we submit all that information again and go through the process that we just saw in that demo. So let's say that we get to the 5-year point and there's a new methodology out, a new version of it that's asking for a lot of the similar data, but maybe there's a few extra data points. Then that's when our live data migration makes a user's activities within the Guardian a lot easier. So here we have a short little demo of that where you could see we have version 1 and version 2 of that policy in there. Now it's been published. And then by clicking on that side menu, you're going to see this drop down where we can click on the migration of that data. So there we're outlining that we have version 2 of the policy. We're going to publish that as well. And we're going to go ahead and discontinue that version of the policy. So this is version 1, it's being discontinued. You could choose if you want to have that discontinuation deferred to a certain date, or if you want to do it immediately. So we're going to go ahead and select immediate. Now that it's been discontinued, no one can use that version of that policy as it's not at the level of regulation that you would want it to be now that there's a new one with new parameters that are required in order for you to get any credits for that project. So here you would choose what policy you want. So we're moving it from version 1 to version 2. All right, so that video is looping now. So you would move it from version 1 to version 2. You could go ahead and choose what schemas you want it in here, the VP documents, the VC documents. So let's say I want to move all my PDD information from that schema to the new one. I can go ahead and select that using dropdowns as well. And now all that data would be in your new project following the regulations that are up to date. So if we have any questions, I'm going to go ahead and open up for that. You could also send us questions to GitHub, Discord, or directly to Envision at our email at info@envisionblockchain.com or our website, www.envisionblockchain.com. And I thank everyone for staying as long as they did. I know there was a lot of data that needed to be put in. And again, usually this would be a process that could take about 2 years to get you to that crediting point. All right, so thank you everyone for joining, and I hope to see you again next month where we cover our next methodology. Thank you.